As we begin the year 2017, world population sits at almost 7.5 billion. We're adding more than 1 million people to the planet every week, and in the process, inflicting irreparable damage on our life-supporting ecosystems. Hi, I'm Dave Gardner. Welcome to the Overpopulation Podcast, project of World Population Balance. You can learn more about us at worldpopulationbalance.org. Historically, some of the most infamous efforts to reduce fertility rates in order to avoid or reduce overpopulation have focused on the poorest people in the world. Many people are aware that fertility rates in industrialized countries like the US are at or even below replacement level. Meanwhile, the 10 nations with the highest fertility rates are all poor nations in Africa, and those rates run between 5.8 and 7.6. But what if I told you the biggest overpopulation problem is in wealthy societies like the United States, Australia, Canada, and Western Europe? Well, my guests today are Colin Hickey and Jake Earl, two doctoral candidates and teaching associates in philosophy at Georgetown University. Hello, gentlemen.
Hi, Dave.
Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Great. In October of last year, 2016, the two of you, along with Travis Reeder at Johns Hopkins, published a paper titled Population Engineering and the Fight Against Climate Change. Now, in the last Overpopulation podcast, I spoke with Travis Reeder about the personal moral obligation to conceive fewer children. Today, Jake and Colin have graciously agreed to talk with me about the pros and cons and intricacies of altering public policy to influence family-size decisions. Now, gentlemen, this paper argues that the threats posed by climate change justify population engineering, as you call it, the intentional manipulation of the size and structure of human populations. Now, I think we all know human overpopulation impacts many things: traffic, aquifers being pumped dry, fertile soil depletion, ocean dead zones, to name but a few. You chose climate change. Why is that?
Great. Thanks, Dave. This is Colin. I think I'll step in for a second here. The central reason, I think, to take on climate change with respect to concerns about population is because it's sort of most likely the widest scale threat to human well-being over the next at least century, beyond that as well. It's in some ways the sort of umbrella environmental challenge, the magnitude of the harms, the scope of the harms, how climate change is produced, implicates and exacerbates basically every other environmental concern. So it's the kind of multiplier of food shortages, water availability, public health and disease control efforts, geopolitical concerns, sustainability of marine ecosystems, habitats, the things you mentioned, pollution, biodiversity, landscape preservation. So in some ways, all of the other major environmental concerns and a lot of other public health concerns are all implicated by how we deal with and how well we mitigate and or adapt to the threats already happening and impending threats from climate change.
Well, that makes sense, and I guess in many ways that seems to be one of the most urgent ticking time bombs we face, or at least we know about, that's for sure, huh?
Yeah.
Well, how did you guys reach the conclusion that reducing population can be a significant strategy against climate disruption?
This is Jake. I think I'll take this one. So we began these conversations a couple years ago. Colin, his main research is in climate change, but I was sort of a neophyte at that time. And one of the things that struck Colin and Travis and I was that, it's pretty well understood what drives climate change. And one of the main causes is just population growth. So climate change is caused by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the amount of greenhouse gases can be calculated by looking at per capita emissions of carbon, methane, other warming gases, and then the number of capitas, you might say. How many people are emitting these gases through their activities? And one of the things that struck us was that, there's very little attention paid from the policy perspective about addressing this enormous factor that's driving global warming. So we thought, well, why not? And what could be done to address this? And would it be morally advisable to do so?
Well, we'll get a little bit into the reasons why perhaps no one was really addressing that, which kind of makes me chuckle. You guys just decided to wade right in with the swim with the sharks, didn't you?
Yeah, we did.
But can you give us an idea of how kind of like a percentage, how significant this could be if we were to decide to focus on reducing family size?
Sure. So, this is an issue that's been understudied. There have been a few studies, though, by climate scientists. One figure that we've come across is that reducing population growth, say by changing our growth rate from the UN's medium projection, which is now projecting that by 2100 there will be slightly over 11 billion people on the planet, to the low projection, which would reduce fertility by an average of 0.5 children per woman. That would result in roughly the same number of people that we have now by 2100. If we were to follow that sort of pathway rather than the median pathway, by 2050, we could see anywhere between 15 and 30% reductions in expected emissions. By 2100, we could see as much as a 40 to 60% reduction in expected emissions. And that's if we do nothing else to mitigate climate change.
And that's just a 0.5. That's just a 0.5 fertility rate reduction, which
a 0.5 fertility rate reduction, which has huge implications over the century in terms of the number of people. But right, not an enormous reduction by any means.
Well, you may have just answered my question. I was next going to ask about this, swimming with the sharks comment that I made a few minutes ago, that it does seem that advising people on how many children it's ethical to conceive seems to be a pretty sticky wicket these days. So I was going to ask you, why not just concentrate on all the other ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Anything to say about that?
Yeah, I'll step in. This is Colin again. In looking through this and trying to figure out, whether it would be permissible to take on, again, this population concern that, people have, again, been reluctant to step into. One of the things that we think is really important is to look at the alternatives, ways of addressing and mitigating and adapting to climate change without addressing population. And so in doing this, we sort of take the lead from the IPCC and look sort of at all of their strategies that they have come up with. They've run a bunch of mitigation scenarios to try and generate, proposals that wouldn't overly burden the economy, that would deal with reducing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere to prevent the worst, most dangerous effects from climate change. And so they propose, and we in the paper, we call this the sort of consensus approach to tackling climate change in a way that doesn't address population in any significant way. And so the sort of consensus approach that comes out of the IPCC involves trying to basically decarbonize the energy supply, increase energy and greenhouse gas efficiency in other economic sectors, taxing and pricing greenhouse gas production, trying to set up ways of altering consumer behavior and lifestyle. So, that might be getting a hybrid, switching to a vegetarian diet, those kinds of things. And, sort of better planning of settlement patterns, transportation systems, those kind of sort of big systemic changes. And I take it we have a number of reasons why we're skeptical that alone is enough, or we should rest comfortably with that sort of consensus approach by itself. And so I'll take you through some of our reasons for having some concern and thinking that we need to at least open the door to the conversation about addressing population with respect to dealing with climate change. So the first thing is that the consensus approach that's laid out in the IPCC, that the Paris Accords sort of agreed upon, at first sort of take the threshold for trying to prevent dangerous climate change to be at around 2 degrees. So they think if we can avoid 2 degrees warming, we'll be avoiding the worst of it. And so the first thing to note is that, and now there's sort of consensus coming out of a lot of political bodies and climate scientists that even if we sort of do all of the measures that require us, or that are required for us to prevent a 2-degree warming, that's not really enough. That threshold still risks far too many harms to human populations and to the environment broadly. So we think that just taking the consensus approach might not be enough to get us to 2 degrees, but even if it, to prevent us from going over 2 degrees warming, but even if it could, and remember that getting there, if you sort of followed the IPCC and the Paris Accords, getting to 2 degrees, even accomplishing that, will require much more significant reductions than what was already been agreed upon in the international negotiations. So that's the sort of first step. The second step is that even if that threshold works, the 2-degree threshold works, in the IPCC, all of their mitigation scenarios to try and get us there leave as high as a 33% chance that we still cross the 2-degree threshold, that we still have all of the harms that come from crossing it, even if we radically decarbonize the energy supply in all of the ways that they recommend. And so we're concerned that probability is much too high. We think we shouldn't be comfortable with it. We should do what we can to try and reduce the chance that we cross that 2-degree threshold. And the last two things that I'll say are that in estimating what we need to do without addressing population, the kind of consensus approach that I outlined a second ago relies on a lot of technological assumptions that we're not particularly comfortable with. So it relies on wide-scale adoption and deployment of carbon capture and storage technologies, usage of nuclear energy. Right now, we just don't have the carbon capture and storage, and so we don't think it's a good idea to bank our sort of climate change mitigation hopes on technology that we don't have and can't use. And then, nuclear energy has its own political hiccups as well. So those are some of the main reasons. We like to point out that it's important to recognize the sort of consensus approach that is outlined in the IPCC to try and deal with climate change without population. They are recommendations that are produced that usually are sort of over-optimistic because there are a lot of political pressures and economic interests in the negotiating parties that negotiate these international agreements. And so we think that there's a lot of room to be looking for alternatives to sort of help the cause, as it were.
Well, you mentioned political pressures and economic interests, and and I just want to kind of add a footnote that I think one of the biggest hurdles, both in the setting that causes us to set timid goals and then makes it really hard for us to even meet those, is that we have this obsession with economic growth. And so as hard as it is to bring ourselves to start talking about overpopulation and trying to affect fertility rates and family size decisions, it seems like it's almost harder for us to talk about scaling back the size of our economy as a reaction to climate change anyway.
Yeah, that's usually not a good political talking point given the climate as it is now.
No kidding. Well, many people assume, let's go back to population now. Many people assume that any effort to reduce population would take way too long to make a meaningful difference in time to avert disaster. And I think that's one of the things that's contributed to the silence. But I think people might be pretty astonished at what you said about how just by 2050 or by the turn of the century, we could see a significant difference.
Yeah, so one of the things that is interesting is generally when people think about population change, people who are even very well informed, they realize, there's population momentum. So the sorts of natural changes that we see in fertility that result from higher incomes and increased literacy rates among women, for example, those do take a long time. But active interventions, things like providing people with birth control, providing them with reproductive care, and some of the perhaps more radical policy proposals we've considered, can reduce fertility at a rate that can, significantly change what the world's human population looks like in terms of size, on the 50 to 100 year time scale, which, coincidentally, is the sort of time scale that we're looking at for the critical climate changes that we're facing. Yeah, so it really doesn't take that long to change even the size of the world's population by billions of people. Yeah.
Yeah, it could, in some ways, it could just take 9 months.
Right.
If we got serious, 9 months
Yes.
from, if we got serious tomorrow, 9 months later, we would start to see a difference.
Absolutely.
Interestingly, yeah. Okay, so you mentioned in the paper that policymakers and moral theorists alike have been reluctant to wade into discussions of population policy. So why is that, do you think, and what do you have to say to them?
So I'll take this one. This is Jake again. One of the interesting things that we found in doing research for this project is that there was a lot of discussion about different sorts of population control efforts around the middle of the century. Lots of studies, lots of political and philosophical debate about these sorts of policies, and then it all got kind of quiet after the 70s. One of the reasons for that is that we saw in a lot of the policies that were actually implemented in places like China, India, Singapore, Peru, and elsewhere, these sorts of policies had a lot of negative effects. People ended up being coerced into having abortions. These policies overburdened poor people and minorities. There were a lot of nasty side effects of these policies, and I think that this resulted somewhat in the policy and political discussion with an overcorrection. So, we saw that, these policies result in coercion and rights violations. So, therefore, no sort of policy that interferes with people's reproductive choices or influences people's reproductive choices is morally permissible. So, we shouldn't talk about them and we shouldn't address them. And I think that that indeed was an overcorrection, and it's led a lot of people to overlook other sorts of ways of influencing people's reproductive decisions that are morally permissible and might have lots of great consequences in terms of public health.
Well, that's a pretty good, quick thumbnail sketch, I think, for us. Thanks for that. Let's go through the 4 types of interventions that you identify in the paper that could effectively reduce human fertility rates. Maybe you could enlighten us a little bit about the spectrum you identify and just really briefly, kind of enumerate what our options are.
So I'll step in here. This is Colin again. So we try and draw out, like a lot of public health interventions, we want to draw out ways of sort of categorizing types of interventions that we could employ to sort of achieve desired effects. And so we think that interventions basically can be arranged on a scale with respect to how risky they are for sort of amounting to or resulting in coercion. So we sketch out 4 categories that we call sort of choice enhancement strategies, which we think have a really, really low risk of coercion. Basically, they're not going to be coercive at all. These are the kinds of things that most people are okay with already, right? We're okay with expanding education access. We're okay with funding family planning services, public health efforts that sort of allow people medical resources that would allow them to family plan on their own. These are the kinds of things that are sort of widely supported, don't risk being coercive really at all. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are the sort of really coercive interventions of the kinds that showed up and sort of tilted the historical discussion away from thinking about population policy significantly. So these are things, like forced abortions, forced sterilizations, things that result in really serious harms and moral wrongs. And then we think that there is a sort of a range in the middle that, if done wrongly, can risk being coercive or morally problematic in other ways, but we think aren't in principle wrong, that could be justifiable, and if designed the right way with contextual features, paying attention to sort of local effects and whatnot, we think that they can be justifiable. And so we call these 2 categories sort of preference adjustment interventions and incentivization interventions. And so I'll just say a little bit really briefly, and I know we're going to talk more about the sort of moral defense for these kinds of interventions later. But when we're talking about sort of preference adjustment, I mean, we can think of a number of strategies to try and influence people's behavior. So we're trying to sort of think of ways of getting people to adjust their preferences to encourage them to have fewer children, right? And so we can think about this category as a sort of way of changing cultural norms and sort of influencing individuals' beliefs and desires, with the goal of getting them to sort of change their procreative behavior. So these are the kinds of things that you might think of as sort of mass communication strategies, right? Mass media, radio, TV content, billboards, poster campaigns,
podcasts.
podcasts, exactly. Thank you. Theater, artist work, that kind of stuff, right? Funding for public lectures, and maybe we'll talk about this more later, but there are a bunch of different ways in which we can do that, and some of them are more and less problematic, and maybe I'll hold off and talk about some of the sort of moral concerns later, and touch really briefly on incentivization strategies, because this is the other sort of middle category that we think can go wrong if it's designed improperly, can have a risk of coercion, but also can be, we think, morally defensible, which, again, we'll argue, sort of present the argument for a little bit later. But incentives are really about sort of directly altering the cost and benefit balance with respect to individual sort of reproductive decisions and behaviors. So there we can think of things like, paying people to take a family planning class, or paying people to fill their birth control prescriptions. Those are what we call sort of positive incentives. And then on the other side, we can think of negative incentives, which we can talk about some of these distinctions later too. But things like, taxes, other kinds of policies that directly alter sort of the costs or benefits associated with having children. Does that provide us with enough of a start to dive in?
Yeah, that's great. This is so fascinating. I think the incentive conversation will be probably one of the most interesting parts of this dialogue that we'll have today. So we'll definitely circle back to that. You guys, being in the philosophy arena, you bend over backwards to really seriously evaluate the consequences of any of these things, and how ethical they are, how moral they are, how intrusive they are in terms of people's rights, I guess I would say. And frequently, I think when you're explaining how you would defend some of these, you mentioned that right now the balance of incentives really is tilted in the other direction. Care to comment on that? Right now, there tend to be, in most countries around the world, there are financial incentives to incentivize having more children.
Sure. So one of the things that we noticed in this research, and looking at objections to policies aimed at influencing people's reproductive choices, is that people who think that we shouldn't have such policies seem to think that reproductive choices now are made in a vacuum, that there aren't strong cultural, social, religious, and even institutional pressures to have more children than one might have had were those pressures not in place. So when people level the charge against us that, these sorts of policies are going to violate people's reproductive freedoms, their reproductive autonomy, one of our responses is to point out, well, look, people now, it's not clear that the decisions that they make are entirely autonomous, especially in the developing world, where in addition to these sorts of pressures on decision, lots of people don't even have the resources to take actual control of their own reproduction. So in developing contexts and in the developed world, we don't really think that we live in a world where full reproductive autonomy is realized. And indeed, perhaps having some policies that push in the other direction could counteract some of these pro-natalist policies and cultural forces that influence and distort people's own decisions and their reproductive values.
You mentioned when you were laying out this the spectrum of potential interventions, the low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff that has really low risk of being coercive or being problematic, the choice enhancement stuff. That sounds so unobjectionable, although there you can always find someone who's going to object to just about anything. But that just is so unobjectionable. Why not just stay there? Why do you make the case for interventions that are even moderately more risky in terms of coercion?
So I think the main reason is that we, as we said before, looking at the data, looking at the projections for how quickly would we need to reduce fertility in order for it to make a significant impact on climate change. It's just that choice enhancement isn't enough. Like with any other sort of policy intervention, it takes a while to get these things set up. It will take time, and we don't have a lot of time. So in terms of efficacy, we think that choice enhancement, even if we could get it set up very quickly, the effects, the adoption rates would be too slow to be able to have a significant effect on climate change. So that led us to look at at these other types of policies, the preference adjustment and incentivization policies. And the closer we looked, the more that we found, there are good policy alternatives within these categories. And we use these sorts of policies all the time in other contexts. Colin mentioned a number of types of policies, but we have public information campaigns to try to get people to stop smoking or to get tested for sexually transmitted infections. We do all sorts of things to incentivize people to see their primary care physician or even to go to the gym. We do all sorts of things to affect people's decisions about their bodies and about their health in order to promote public health and even sometimes to promote environmental values. And so we thought, well, maybe there's not a big difference between these sorts of preference adjusting and incentivizing policies that we do in other contexts and using these sorts of policies to affect people's reproductive decisions.
In the paper, you guys do a great job of analyzing the kind of the differences in all the different considerations, depending on whether you're talking about a developing population in a developing country or a population in the industrialized world. And isn't it true that the biggest greenhouse gas emitters today are in the wealthy nations, the overdeveloped nations of the world, and they have less. There's less of a deficit of choice enhancement. They already have more access to education and better gender equity, so that would kind of force us to move farther along on the spectrum because of the urgency that you just mentioned.
Yeah, Dave, that's exactly right. That's one of the other sort of main reasons why we in the paper think that we're justified in looking beyond the sort of easier to defend choice enhancement strategies, because as you pointed out, and you mentioned this actually in your opening, in your introduction, that the biggest effects, while there are still gaps in access to contraceptives and family planning services in the United States and the developed world, it's the sort of bang for your buck is much smaller there than it is in the developing world. And so to get any inroads in populations where the per capita emissions just swamp out the per capita emissions in some of the developing contexts. I mean, sometimes 10, 50, 200 times greater emissions by the average American than some people in poorer people in developing nations. Right? The way to reach them to adjust and try and change reproductive behavior in those populations where we can achieve much greater emissions reductions per child avoided, we think the strategies that would actually be efficacious, just sort of by necessity, go beyond just the mere sort of provision of contraceptives, family planning services, choice enhancement strategies that, as you said, are already sort of, while not perfect, decently well attained in some developed contexts.
But at the same time, you guys do a really terrific job, I think, in the paper of addressing why we shouldn't just ignore those populations that have currently very low carbon footprint but high fertility rate. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think again there are a couple of reasons for why we need to look at basically everybody to sort of all hands on deck approach and not just look at only the strategies that would affect wealthy people in the developed world. And so the couple of reasons I think are basically as follows. Now, we just know sort of predictably as a matter of the sort of empirical data that we have that these developing nations will continue to develop. They are developing and will continue to develop. And while there's been a little bit of a tempering in some contexts of how intense with respect to greenhouse gases all of that development actually is, in most places, especially over the next 50 to 100 years, that development is going to come with net greenhouse gas emission increases, right? So when you lift people out of poverty, which we think is a moral necessity, it's a moral requirement. People are facing really serious deprivation and injustice by being in absolute poverty. But when you lift them out, right, usually you have an increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and we're going to see that predictably in wide swaths of the developing world. So it's both true that they will develop in these contexts, and they should develop. I mean, life of absolute poverty is something really, really, really we need to avoid. And so while the sort of per capita emissions avoided per child avoided are smaller initially in the near term in some of these developing nations that have low carbon footprints right now, over the long term, they matter because these are big populations increasing in wealth. So that's one part of it. The second part is just thinking sort of generally going back to our sort of 4-category spectrum of types of interventions. We think that any broader population engineering program is going to have to include developing nations, no matter what, with respect at least to the choice enhancement stuff, because those are, the education, family planning stuff that we've talked about. Those sort of are obviously going to be justifiable to deploy in developing contexts because they're autonomy enhancing, because they benefit individuals in those contexts. So no matter what, they're going to get linked in by just the sort of choice enhancement stuff. And then, as we'll talk about later, we think that some of the incentive category and some of the sort of preference adjustment media campaign strategies, those also can be choice enhancement, can be choice enhancing. So we think that there's a sort of moral good provided for the individuals as well as this sort of the development happens, and the more emissions developing nations take on, the bigger gains we get from dealing with population stuff there now anyway, even though emissions right now are lower.
Yeah, I want to put my spin on it. This is really just kind of repeating what you just said in a different way. If we don't plan on keeping the developing world poor, then in 100 years, those populations are going to be a significant challenge, huge. And kind of coupled with that, boy, what if we had started working on population 100 years ago? Wouldn't we be in a much better place today? So it's just foolish to ignore a population with a really high fertility rate because it's going. We know just because of the mathematics of exponential growth that's going to eventually be a problem.
Yeah, and I'll just flag here, and we'll talk about this later as we sort of develop what the sort of broader vision is. But just to put a little point on it here, given that the sort of question is, well, so why we know we can get a lot of carbon reductions by dealing with the developed world, and the question is why deal with the developing world too, is it's important that with respect to our proposal that not all of the same strategies are going to apply in every context, right? So we're going to have a different sort of network of intervention strategies depending on the context. And so we can talk about that a little bit later, but I think that's important to flag here, is that we think we need to address them all, but we'll address them in slightly different ways.
Differently, sure. Okay, so before we get back to the incentives, let's talk about the other part in the middle of the spectrum, the preference adjusting interventions. Some objectors, could just object to some of that as psychological manipulation. Can you address that?
Yeah, so I'll jump in again here. Yeah, so this is good. I mean, so I think there's a real worry that people have, which is that so even if these kinds of communication strategies, media efforts, even if they're not coercive in the sort of strict sense, that they might still be morally problematic, that they might still violate autonomy rights, even if they don't make people worse off or anything, they might be manipulative. And so we can sort of think, along the lines of what, concerns we have with brainwashing or propaganda. That propaganda, brainwashing, they don't have to necessarily make the person that's brainwashed worse off, right? They don't have to, strictly speaking, coerce them into doing something. You don't have to threaten them. You don't have to close off options and make it, you don't have to, point a gun to their head and tell them to do something. But there still seems to be something problematic with respect to the individual making an autonomous choice. And so while I think, there are legitimate concerns about some kinds of strategies that might be sort of classified along with the strategies we're talking about that could be called preference adjustment interventions, we think the things that we've actually outlined, it's pretty easy to avoid some of the sort of worst forms of interventions that might be might be really manipulative, might sort of look more like brainwashing or the kinds of things that we would actually have a moral problem with. So most of the really problematic forms involve deceit, trickery, false information, and we don't really think we need any of that. The kinds of strategies that we defend that I laid out a little bit earlier, are again really about changing cultural norms. And right, so if we're talking about radio, podcast, TV content, billboards, right, a lot of this, and there are, historically a number of cases of this through India and radio programs in Africa and Mexico, sort of telenovelas that sympathetically show characters changing their views about the ideal family size, or that, depict family planning and, sort of spacing of children apart, or, restraining childbearing, showing some of the hardships of having too many children, just sort of casting small family size in a positive light, suggesting role models or suggesting ideas and narratives that people can empathize with, that they can identify with, and sort of see these, see as an option, sort of open pathways. And we don't really think that any of that looks like the kinds of concerns that would be really manipulative, the sort of brainwashing, really propaganda forms that require deceit or trickery. And sort of, importantly, Jake sort of gestured at this a little bit ago, that we accept these kinds of interventions in all sorts of other settings without thinking they're psychologically manipulative or without thinking they're brainwashing. So we do this with sexual health, with STD education, right? Jake mentioned, sort of anti-smoking campaigns. Advertising generally is like this. And now there might be some problems with some advertising, but if the kinds of strategies we outline all count as psychologically manipulative, then I think the worry is that way too many things would count as psychologically manipulative, and sort of everything would be morally problematic along these lines.
Yeah, but you don't see anyone objecting to, a "Just Say No to Drugs" poster, or even like the Rosie the Riveter posters, during the war effort. Everybody, that was clearly propaganda designed to influence public behavior.
Right.
With no objections.
Right. Yeah.
And I was going to say, there's plenty of propaganda right now. There's plenty of pronatalist propaganda out there right now.
Yeah, exactly. And so Jake was sort of talking about some of this stuff a little bit earlier, and yeah, along the same lines, we think that in some ways these can be correctives, right? These can be correctives to sort of resettle the debate, so it's a live option, that people aren't immediately shamed at the prospect of not having kids, or pressured by family, pressured by religious institutions, pressured by culture broadly, or pressured by tax code. These kinds of things we think can be correctives for some of those pressures.
Okay, well, let's move on to incentives. This is going to be an exciting conversation, and let me just maybe kind of light a match here and say that it's kind of hard to engineer around the fact that negative incentives are definitely more likely to influence the poor than they are the rich. I'm personally not sure that is an ethical or moral problem, but you guys seem to take a very, very kind and considerate role, and you consider all that and go through you guys jump through a lot of hoops you don't really prescribe a specific system, but you do lay out a framework that you think would help guide us to being as fair as possible. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out as a spark to the conversation, and then just let you guys kind of explain the framework, what you kind of arrived at regarding incentives.
Yeah, so I'll take conversation on this one.
Good luck with that.
Thanks so much. So I think that, our discussion of incentives is probably one of the most controversial parts of this project, in part because, a lot of the worst policies, regarding population in the 20th century involved some sort of incentive scheme, often with, government officials deceiving people about the nature of what's required to get these incentives and what the risks involved are. India, has a tumultuous political history with these sorts of programs. One of the things that, just picking up on, Dave, your remark about poorer people being more easily influenced by negative incentives, we think that that's right, they would be more easily influenced. If we were to say uniformly tax people for having more than one child, that would absolutely be a regressive tax. It would much more easily influence poorer people than richer people. We also think, though, that it carries a much larger risk of coercion, much larger risk of actually violating people's, bodily rights and reproductive rights to place that extra burden on the poor. And additionally, we think that we could accomplish a lot of the same sorts of goals in terms of reducing fertility through positive incentives. So when it comes to incentives, we've kind of adopted this general sort of guideline of carrots for the poor, sticks for the rich, where the sticks are understood as sort of a last resort. We think that we could go a long way with the other policies. But really that, when thinking about incentives, we reserve the negative incentives, those that, reduce some kind of benefit that people had access to previously for wealthier people who can bear the cost in some more robust way than poor people can.
Well, I know I'm going to get in trouble for what I said, so and I didn't say it well. I guess what I really meant to say was that I don't want to pick on poor people, and I certainly don't want to come up with policies that would weed them out in some kind of new age eugenics program. That's certainly not what I have in mind at all. But I do feel like we need to eliminate the subsidies that socialize the cost of having more children somehow. But at the same time, can we find a way where we can really beat up on the rich people who, no matter what we throw at them, it seems like, Mitt Romney's going to be able to afford to have a large family. How do we influence the family size decisions of people like Mitt Romney, for example?
So this is a great question, and we've gotten this challenge before. So negative incentives would be very effective for poorer people, and it seems that they would be less effective unless we want to leverage very, very large disincentives for wealthy people. Again, as you pointed out, we haven't worked out all of the details. We do think, though, that incentives should be structured progressively, just because it will take fewer incentives, and generally positive incentives will be more effective, sort of the lower on the income scale you are. As you move up to medium income, maybe we, drop sort of all positive or negative incentives. And then as we get to the higher income brackets, that's where we start introducing, say, negative incentives for higher order children. Now, granted, we know that the Romneys are a great case, right? So very wealthy families who are just dead set for whatever sort of reasons on having, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children, likely they will bear the costs of any sort of, non-coercive negative incentives that we could offer. However, we can also get a lot of money out of those people, a lot of money that can be put toward other sorts of efforts, funding reproductive health care for poorer people or other climate change mitigation efforts globally and domestically. So in some sense, you might say that what we really think would be useful, even if we can't influence all that strongly very wealthy people and their reproductive decisions, we can at least have some sort of carbon tax, their reproductive behaviors.
I do want to give you a chance to maybe explain a little bit about how you kind of work out something that you think would be as fair as possible to people who are, closer to the poverty level. Can you outline that for us?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that And again, it's worth distinguishing, talking about people who are in poverty, say, in a developed nation like the United States, and people who are in poverty in various places like Tanzania or Zambia or places like that. It's a very different kind of poverty. But we do generally think that when it comes to poorer people, we prioritize choice enhancement. So giving people the tools that they need just in order to make the decisions that they want to make with regard to how many children that they have. So making reproductive health care, birth control, giving them information about family planning methods, the benefits and drawbacks of those methods, making that available to them. Generally, poorer people have much less control over their own reproduction than wealthier people. We also think that poorer people, again, both domestically and internationally, are going to be much more influenced by the various preference adjustment media campaigns that Colin was talking about a moment ago. These are much more effective for people who tend to be less educated and tend to be less informed about these issues already. So we think that, for all we know, and again, we're not policy experts. We would like to get policy experts to weigh in on this. For all we know, it might be possible that people living at or near the federal poverty level in the United States, that only those policies would do enough to significantly reduce their fertility rates, or reduce them enough that we can say, well, now we can focus our efforts elsewhere. But then beyond that, we also envision positive incentives that would be targeted at poorer families to get them to make decisions that, or at least consider decisions that might be in their best interest with respect to making their family smaller. So, incentivizing or giving families some sort of payment for taking family planning classes, incentivizing women to see a primary care physician or a gynecologist on a regular basis. These are sorts of interventions that we know that when they're done regularly tend to reduce people's fertility rates. And it's one thing to make them free or lower their cost. It's another thing to say, well, we'll give you a $200 credit or something like that for seeing your gynecologist once a year, or for taking one of these family planning classes. We think that could do a lot to really change behaviors. But again, something that we want to point out internationally, and even somewhat so domestically, in terms of bang per buck, it's wealthier children that go on to produce more greenhouse gases. So in some sense, if we have $1 to spend toward one of these policies, and we could choose to target, say, reducing fertility of a wealthier person or reducing fertility of a poorer person, we might want to target the wealthier person to see if we can lower their fertility, because that'll just have a larger effect on reducing greenhouse gases.
Good point, but I guess I still want to focus one more question on the poor in the already overdeveloped world, because there's frequently conversations among sustainable population advocates will pop up where they talk about the fact that we've got these we've got the wrong kind of incentives in place now. Right now, we've got child tax credits, and we've got income tax deductions and welfare payments that almost amount to have another baby, get a bigger check. And a lot of that's designed to make sure that the welfare of those children is better. So would you advise that we consider making adjustments to that at all?
So I think that this is a really great concern. One of the problems with some historical policies aimed at reducing fertility, Singapore as an example comes to mind, the policies they implemented in the 70s and early 80s, is that, if you target behaviors sort of at the wrong point in time or in the wrong point in the life cycle, you end up just harming children. So for instance, Singapore had a policy where, if you have more than some designated number of children, then your children are going to have, they're not going to have the same access to good public schools. So they had a lottery system in place. And so, your students will get a worse lottery ranking if you end up having too many children in your family. We tend to shy away from policies like that, in part because, as you pointed out, these sorts of policies would hurt children who are not, liable for having been born. Not their fault. They didn't choose the family that they were born into. We think that one way to get around and to mitigate this sort of problem is specifically to target what we call upstream behaviors. So, the positive and negative incentives being targeted at, behaviors about, how to reproduce, when to reproduce, how, when to get healthcare, what kind of information people are getting before they, say, become pregnant, before they decide, let's have our third child. And again, when it comes to talking about poorer people, the threat of coercion is much more significant. A $300 penalty is going to affect, a family making $35,000 a year much more heavily than that same penalty will affect a family making twice as much or 3 times or 4 times as much. So,
in a way, the answer maybe is obvious, but maybe not. Maybe you just wrote that paper to tweak us a little bit. Do you think we're ready for this conversation?
Good question.
And maybe you've changed your mind, just based on the reactions to the paper since it was published, too.
Yeah, so I suspect Jake and I will both say a little bit on this. it's interesting. So I focus on climate change and global justice in my sort of central research. My doctoral work is on that. And so often people that work in climate stuff, it's hard for us to be particularly optimistic, and it's easy for us to slip into cynicism. And, so I think my honest answer is not totally sure. However, even though sort of politically we've seen some discouraging outcomes recently with respect to thinking about how to deal with climate change, recognizing its reality, much less its magnitude, and dealing with sort of morally justifiable ways of trying to avoid the most dangerous effect. So while there's sort of political obstacles, the public opinion towards addressing climate change is more positive. And when we sort of deliver over these arguments to charitable readers, people are sort of like more sympathetic than I think we originally thought we might get as responses. We've gotten plenty of climate deniers that aren't particularly happy, but
there's been some surprisingly positive response, huh?
Yeah, and I think partly some of this might come with respect to some of the pro-natalist atmosphere that we have out there. That I think some people are kind of looking for this conversation to be raised again, for permission to sort of break away from some of the pro-natalist norms, right? And younger people sort of making their family planning decisions right now. Like, I think people are open, at least now, to thinking through some of the pressures that existed and for them to have more kids than they wanted. And now, like, it's in some ways, for some of the people that have been in touch with us, like a kind of relief to hear people talking about and maybe trying to shift some of these norms to produce less pressure on them to have kids that make the grandparents happy and stuff.
Yeah.
But I'll just say, and I'm sure Jake will probably chime in here too. I mean, so I think that there's a lot that needs to happen for us to sort of fully be ready to both have this conversation and to think about implementing some of it. And some of the strategies that we're talking about, and we acknowledge in the paper, and we want to sort of reiterate here how important it is that we get the input from demographers and social scientists and public policy folks. And we've sort of tried to lay some of the philosophical, moral theoretic groundwork, but in order to sort of really tackle a population engineering program with the framework that we've sort of tried to lay out that we think is like morally defensible, I mean, we need a lot of help, a lot of data, a lot of media, a lot of further sort of intellectual investment in this issue and in these concerns.
So do you think the timing is good then? Do you think you might have picked the right time where you didn't piss everybody off, and we can take this dialogue and start developing it?
Yeah, go for it.
I think I can say with some certainty that we haven't pissed everybody off. We have gotten a lot of very positive, a lot of very encouraging feedback. A lot of that feedback is coming from people who have been paying attention to the population issue for decades now. It's been very humbling and encouraging to get support from a lot of those people. And also we've heard back from a number of people who work in empirical fields, in policy planning, in demography, who now think that, oh, well, now I can actually look at these issues because they're not, you guys have given us an argument that they're not morally taboo. And I think that, this is in some way unfortunate. I think that in one way, the public is ready, in part because the population is growing at such an amazing rate. I remember it wasn't that long ago when Earth's population passed 6 billion people, and it took even less, or it will take even less to pass the 8 billion mark. So I think that people are seeing that. I think that people are now seeing the early effects of climate change. And unfortunately, as a species, we didn't really act quickly enough to address climate change without addressing population. I think that might have been possible at some point, but unfortunately we didn't do that, and so here we are. So I think that in some way that those members of the public who acknowledge the real, dare I say, existential danger posed by climate change are now going to be willing to listen to what some years ago would still sound like, completely off the wall, radical solutions to the problem.
And I'll just add in, it was interesting. So I've actually sort of taught this material in 2 classes. I taught this population climate change material in an environmental ethics class that I was teaching and in a global justice class that I was teaching. And I was interested and surprised, so not just the sort of people that have been paying attention to population, for a long time, since the 70s, but I have college-age students that I was sort of surprised actually how receptive and sympathetic they were to the argument, once we worked through it. And I think there might be a number of sort of reasons or explanations for why, younger audiences are more receptive than others. Climate change has been a force for their whole development and lives. Maybe it's because they're not thinking about having kids yet, but they sort of, have often a better sense of the climate science, and they're also going to have to live with the consequences for longer periods and sort of more dramatically deal with them than us or my, grandparents, et cetera. And so that was encouraging to see, when we can sort of dwell on the argument, in the context of an academic setting and sort of go through it where it's not just, a headline, that's wild philosophers think that we need to change the population. When people see the arguments we laid out here, people I think are much more receptive and sympathetic. And so I think then, part of preparing us to sort of take advantage of the moment that, we've seen some good climate change mobilization, right? So we saw what happened in Standing Rock. We saw the People's Climate March, right? There's energy. There's great work that organizations like 350.org are doing to mobilize around climate change. And with respect to that energy, we think that if we can, communicate, educate people about the kinds of arguments we're talking about here and show some of the limitations of the non-population strategies and some of the risks that we face by not trying to address population concerns, I think the more exposure the idea has, the more education we can have to communicate that there are morally defensible ways of doing this, right? That it doesn't have to all be the sort of horror and nightmare stories that we've seen historically when people start thinking about population control, right? If we can change the script, change some of the sort of atmosphere around thinking about population to get away from some of the horrors that were really, really serious, egregious moral wrongs and rights violations, but to show that there are alternatives that still tackle population, I think people are willing to be receptive to these ideas in this sort of political moment that is.
Well, this definitely sounds pretty optimistic. So maybe one of my last questions for you then might be, where do we go from here? And it may be a different answer for preference adjustment than it is for incentives. Who do we need to expect to make these changes, or how do we start to make these things happen? Sorry.
This is a tough question, Dave.
It's really not your job. It's not your job.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Like we've done the work. Hand it off. Let other people take it from here.
Yeah.
No. I'm joking. So yeah, this is a tough question. I'm not totally sure how to give a satisfying answer. So we're of course continuing to work on this issue. We've got a follow-up paper, but there's only so much that you can accomplish in sort of in academic journal settings. So I think especially with respect to the sort of preference adjustment informational campaigns, I mean, in some ways, right, we need information, media, communication services, right, to support these kinds of efforts. And we need the funding from people that would be sympathetic. There's a lot of power that people in positions of celebrity have, that people in positions of media have. And with respect to delivering over the sort of information and playing out the role modeling and opening up, scripts where people can think of it as a possibility to have fewer children, my sense at least is that we need a lot of help from if people with power in media. And
Yeah.
Jake, I don't know if you want to talk about the incentivization.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things about, less so with the preference adjustment policies that we were talking about, but still, it's still an issue. But even more so with incentives is that, it doesn't do much work to incentivize people to do something if they then don't have the tools that they need to do it. So, we can talk about, say, incentives for people to, see a physician, but, if they don't trust physicians, if they don't know how to find one, if they don't, speak the same language as the physician, then, all those incentives are going to be for naught. In some sense, we recognize that all of these policy proposals that we're recommending need to come together in some kind of package. And in some ways, choice enhancement lays the groundwork insofar as that gives people the tools that they need to take control of their own decisions. So I think in terms of political priorities, something like, and I think that there are a lot of authors who agree with us on this for a lot of different reasons, something like a global program aimed at giving people, just giving them control over their reproductive lives is, if not a prerequisite, then something that needs to be done in tandem, say with implementing preference adjustment and incentivization policies. But again, I think Colin has said this before, we don't know. We're not economists, we're not policy experts, we're not demographers, we're not climate scientists. We're just humble moral philosophers. So I think that the next proximate step, and we would love if someone would reach out to us, is to actually figure out, all right, well, what would the fertility targets be over the next few decades? And then once we have that information, how much and how quickly would we need to reduce fertility, and then what kind of climate change payoff would that have? Then we can start pegging policies and start seeing, okay, well, here's the set of policies we would need to see this kind of decline in fertility in the United States or in China or in sub-Saharan Africa, within this time period. Unfortunately, there's just a lot that we don't know at this point.
So let me know if I hear you right, that we need to just continue and step up our efforts in choice enhancement and preference adjustment, and that will eventually, hopefully, get us to a point where it is possibly politically realistic to start talking about the incentives, which it's safe to say would be years away, unfortunately.
It may not be that far away.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll say this for myself. I don't know if Colin or if Travis would agree with me. In the United States and in a lot of other nation states, there are pronatalist policies aimed at encouraging people to have more children. I think that we could do away with those policies, or implement policies to mitigate the effects when they're not policies, but say, cultural factors. I know that Russia and Singapore have recently implemented such policies. I don't think there would be much risk of rights violation or of coercion or harm to reverse those policies. I think that's a first step in changing the incentives. But yeah, aside from those, I think that we are maybe a little ways off yet from figuring out, okay, well, what kind of incentive structures would be just, and which ones would be efficacious for actually dealing with the problem at hand.
Great way to put it.
I think that is definitely more likely to be true for the incentives side for sure too, because I think that there actually are, and sort of right now, prior to doing much else, without very serious risk of injustices, without risk of manipulation, without risk of rights violations, I think there are things that we could do right now with respect to the choice enhancement stuff, where we don't really have to figure out much more research, because the cost, the initial investment is really low. I mean, it might even be none if we convince the right people that then go out and take public stands on things, right? So the sort of power, again, going back to this, but the power of celebrity. So imagine if we convince some of the biggest voices in sort of popular culture, and in the way that, say, Leonardo DiCaprio has taken on climate change, right? Created a documentary, goes and speaks at the UN, goes and speaks, right? If you start having, campaigns coming from people that have been convinced by the argument, right, that open up these options that try and adjust norms and values. I think we can do that, right now, if people are willing to take up that mantle. And so, I'm putting a lot on sort of media, but of course, like any good activism, like any good strategizing, grassroots campaigns also matter, and matter in sort of more significant ways, as a matter of fact. So I don't want to sort of take any of the power away from thinking about organizing and trying to just educate and get people on the ground, grassroots level, thinking about some of these preference adjustment strategies. But I think some of that we can do without much further research.
All right, Leonardo DiCaprio, did you hear that? Give me a call. Give me a call.
He's listening.
You can reach me, Dave Gardner at worldpopulationbalance.org. We've been talking about the paper that was published last October, Population Engineering and the Fight Against Climate Change. I want to mention that that's not one of those papers that's only in existence behind a paywall somewhere, that it is pretty easy to find that. My advice would be, if you Google that, you'll turn it up. I don't know if you guys have a better, easier way to point people to that if they want to read that.
That's the best way.
Yeah, that's the best way. It's you can find it on any one of our academia.edu profiles if you Google it. It's also linked to on an NPR story about the work. But yeah, if you Google it, you'll find it easily.
Okay, and you mentioned a follow-up paper. When is that going to be published?
It's currently under review, so we don't know, but we'll be sure to let you know.
That's great. We will look forward to that very much. Well, thank you much, Colin Hickey and Jake Earl. Fascinating conversation, and it's about time that we had it.
Great. Thank you so much for having us, Dave.
Yeah, thank you, Dave.
Appreciate your time. Well, that's it for this edition of the Overpopulation Podcast. Please visit worldpopulationbalance.org to learn more about how we can solve world overpopulation. And at that website, you can actually sign the Sustainable Population Pledge. You can listen to all our podcasts, get on our email list, and you can even make a donation, tax deductible in the U.S., to support our work. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Dave Gardner, reminding you, when you're planning your family, think small.